Hello, welcome everyone. We are excited to kick off Nanit's final September Parent Like a Pro webinar, Toddler Safety One-on-One. On behalf of the Nanit team, I'm thrilled to have you all here, along with our two incredible panelists, Holly Choi of Safe Beginnings and Dr. Krupa Playforth, whom many of you may know as the pediatrician mom on Instagram. I'm Janice Chow, a certified positive discipline parent educator, and I'm currently supporting the Nanit social media team during a maternity leave cover for the next few months. I'd love to hand it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Holly, would you like to start?
Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Choi. I am a baby and toddler safety expert based in Vancouver, BC. My main areas of expertise are car seat safety, first aid, injury prevention, and childproofing, but really anything to do with baby and toddler safety, I am all over it. I am a mom of two, so I've been through it, but they're now 6.5 and 9. So thankfully, I'm out of the toddler phase, but I understand what you're going through.
Krupa?
Hi, I'm Dr. Playforth. I am a board certified pediatrician. I started the pediatrician mom a few years ago at the start of the pandemic because I felt like there wasn't enough evidence-based, balanced information out there for parents. And, there's not enough time in pediatric office visits often to ask the questions or get the answers that you want. So I'm trying to basically create like a practical information platform. I have three kids, 9, 6, and I am very much in the toddler phase with my 3-year-old. Actually, some of the stuff we're talking about we are like right in the thick of it. But you can find me at the Pediatrician Mom.
Thank you. Thank you, Holly and Krupa. We are so happy to have you here to share your expertise. Now, as many of us parents probably already know firsthand, toddlers are eager to explore their independence, whether it's wanting to do something themselves or saying things like, no, I do it. It's a big milestone in their development. Of course, we want to encourage that independence and help them build those skills, but safety is always top of mind. Holly, what advice do you have for parents on balancing their child's growing independence with safety awareness?
Yeah, this is hard. And I will just say, as someone that has just anxiety all the time anyway, having anxiety as a parent about safety is something that is in a league of its own. And I think a lot of us go through that, but something that really helped me and a piece of messaging I always like to pass on to parents. You have to learn to understand the difference between what's a risk and what's a hazard. So, a risk is something where you're going to have the potential where there could be an injury, a small injury, but they're going to get a benefit from it. So, whether that's climbing rocks and potentially they'll scrape their knee or fall down, they might learn something about gravity, but they're going to get all of these physiological, social, emotional benefits of doing that thing versus something that's a hazard. And the most blunt example I can give for that would be letting a baby play with broken glass. There's no benefit that they're going to get from that. So that's just something we avoid doing. When you're able to differentiate, is this something where they could get a benefit or is it just a hazard? And you are able to separate those two things, it makes that safety decision making a lot more clear and easy. And of course, we all have different risk tolerances, and that's totally fine. But being able to check in with yourself and say, okay, well, that is a hazard. So I'm definitely in the right to not want to do that thing. So that would be my main piece of advice.
So like a hazard is like a red light and a risk is like a yellow light.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for helping to like really make that clear distinction when we are observing our children at play and wanting to balance those two different types of play. So thank you. Krupa, I think most parents would agree that the shift from infancy to toddlerhood is huge. Suddenly our babies are on the move and everything seems to change. Can you walk us through how safety considerations evolve as our little ones go from being infants to becoming active toddlers?
think you're totally right. The biggest safety changes as your child moves from infancy to toddlerhood is related to the fact that they're developing like a whole lot of skills. They're mobile, they're gaining dexterity, they're taller, and they still don't understand danger, and they also don't like to hear no. And those developmental changes are normal and appropriate, but as a parent, they're also very, very stressful because you have to, like, whenever you walk into a room, you have to so quickly anticipate where the gaps are in the childproofing. And toddlers are at a special risk because they don't understand what is dangerous and what is not, right? They are just exploring their world. And so we kind of have to be the safety net for them. I think a lot of parents also don't necessarily shift their thinking. An infant is under the age of 12 months, and then they are toddlers after that. But a lot of people still think of their 1 to 2 year olds as infants. But 1 to 2 year olds, they understand a lot of stuff. They can communicate and they can move and get into things.
Absolutely. And like on that topic, Holly, as toddlers start becoming more mobile, crawling, walking, and climbing, like Krupa said, you walk into a room and suddenly you're seeing all of these new challenges and risk or hazard spaces pop up. So what are some key safety tips that parents should keep in mind as their young toddler becomes more adventurous?
So there's definitely a few really good ones here to talk about, and don't let me forget to talk about transitioning out of the crib from a safety perspective with this one. Specifically, I want to talk about boundaries.
We will
But
absolutely get into that.
perfect. I have ADHD. However, I do want to say that it's really important to be able to look at the world from their perspective. And sometimes you have to just physically do that, get on their level and see what they are actually looking at, what they can see. A really strong example from me from a safety perspective is anchoring furniture. So furniture tip overs are, in my personal opinion, probably the largest hazard that we all have in our home that a lot of us still don't think about. It's one of those things, and not to be a bummer right now, but it's one of those things where the repercussions of that injury are so high versus some of these smaller things like bumps on the corner of a coffee table. We've sometimes put our priorities in the wrong place when it comes to what we're trying to protect them from. So, with looking at the world through their level, think about what they might see in a room. If they look up on a dresser and they see a remote for a TV, that looks like fun. So they might try to climb that dresser. Does the dresser look like a staircase if they pull the drawers out? Does a bookcase look like a ladder that they could climb? And if they don't understand the repercussions of that thing they're doing or what could potentially happen, we can't expect them to not necessarily do that thing. It's a very logical progression for them to think, I'm going to try to climb that and then I will get my reward. So making sure that you look at those hazards in your space. But a big piece of advice, if you do one baby proofing thing for me, please, it's always anchor your furniture. It's, for me, just a non-negotiable. So thankfully I have remembered the second part that I wanted to talk about here, which was boundaries. So I know we're going to talk a lot about crib transitions, but with boundaries in particular, if you go stay at your friend's house, let's say for a weekend, and they say, okay, here's the room you're going to stay in, you probably don't get out of bed at night and like go through all of their stuff and like walk around in their kitchen and look in their cabinets and things like that.
You don't do
that?
But toddlers don't have those imaginary boundaries like we do. They don't understand, we put you in your room, you're safe in your room, and we're expecting you to stay there at night. And so you kind of always have to be one step ahead from a safety perspective of, okay, if they open the door, what's next? If I've got my door shut and I'm fast asleep, I'm not going to know necessarily. So is that walking towards the stairs? Is that walking towards the bathroom? What's the next hazard they could encounter? And how can I put some layers of protection in place so that at least they are either slowed down or stopped before something happens? So I do like this is one of the things where having a baby monitor in their room for a bit still is very helpful. And then ultimately, sure, you can move it to the playroom, but you really want to have that little bit of hand holding for that transition because they don't quite get it. And that's fine for them. But yeah, don't do it as an adult. That's weird.
Yeah. I want to explore that idea of the imaginary boundaries, like especially at night, but I do want to just quickly call back to your really important critical point about anchoring furniture. I know that like a lot of people immediately think of the bookshelf, tall dressers, but are there any bits of furniture that parents may overlook that you would always recommend anchoring? And as a follow-up, if some IKEA furniture, for example, includes those anchor kits, do you feel that those are resilient enough to hold the furniture, or do you recommend upgrading to something more? So a two-part question there.
Great questions. So there's kind of a general rule of thumb with what we anchor. And I will say, because I know someone's going to immediately ask this if they haven't yet, do we anchor cribs? No. The way cribs are weighted and designed, they are not meant to tip. The child is typically inside the crib. Yes, they may try to climb the crib from the outside, but the way that cribs are designed, we're not concerned about anchoring them. It is generally, though, things that are either taller than they are deep. So if you think of a bookcase being taller than it is deep, anchor it. That tends to be more top heavy and more likely to tip. Does it have 2 or 3 drawers? Anchor it. So if it has a few levels that they could make that staircase when they pull drawers out, a lot of the pushback I get about anchoring furniture is around, well, that's a really heavy dresser. I don't think a baby could ever pull that down. There's no way I couldn't pull that down as a 250-pound man. Well, the center of gravity changes when we have children climbing on things.
Mhm.
And an easy way that I will use to convince people is pull out the first few drawers of that dresser and put a bit of weight on one of the drawers when you've got it pulled out. It is really shocking how easy some of that stuff can tip. So to come back to your second question about furniture anchors and quality and what should I be using, the stuff that comes with the IKEA kits, it's okay in terms of a quality perspective. The issue is that when most people install them, the furniture often has like pre-drilled locations for you to put those anchors,
Mhm.
and those anchors likely don't line up with your studs. And for furniture to truly be properly fastened to the wall, we want it to be anchored into studs. So if you can do that, great. If you can't meet the studs with that piece of furniture based on where it's located and where those holes are, I recommend using anchoring straps. So furniture straps, they look kind of like, if you imagine like a fanny pack, belt bag, backpack strap, like a little woven strap, but they're flexible, and it means that you screw one side into the back of the furniture on each corner, and then the other sides can be put at an angle and stretched to meet those studs so that you're properly in the studs. And the benefit as a parent, if they drop something behind that dresser, you can loosen the straps off of it, pull the dresser forward, get stuff out, and then tighten it back to the wall. So there's multiple benefits, but personally, I do use something else, being the furniture straps. I think it's just a safer, more helpful option.
Thank you so much for the additional details and recommendations in terms of, making sure that the furniture we have in our house, is secure, safe, and stable. So I do want to explore a little bit more about the imaginary boundaries that you mentioned. And Holly, I know you brought this up, but Krupa, I'd love to get your feedback and insight. Like, as parents, we know where we want our toddlers to stay, in their bed, especially at night, but they're just starting to understand those imaginary boundaries. They're just starting to, click it all in. I stay in my bed at night. How can we help toddlers grasp the idea of staying in their room or bed when it doesn't necessarily come naturally to them, or their desire to explore is just overriding that?
Think that you got to think about it a little bit from their point of view, and then you've got to put in a lot of work before you make the transition, ideally. So you want to so I have a 3-year-old and we are about to make this transition from crib to bed, but anticipating beforehand so that you're setting the framework for those boundaries before they've even become like a realistic option. Doing social stories and reading books and talking about it. Very few of us really learn or grasp any concept if we just get told once. And so these are ongoing conversations. You work it in over and over and over again. And that repetition is part of them learning, okay, this is an actual rule. Preparing your space. So you prepare your toddler, you prepare your space. And then a lot of where it becomes challenging is being consistent as a parent, because if your toddler is up and wandering around at night and you are tired, it's really easy to kind of fall into patterns where you are not reinforcing those rules, but being consistent between parents, between other caregivers at nap time and overnight, that everybody sleeps in their own bed, and not reacting emotionally, right? Like, this is just a matter of fact, like, this is just a rule of our family, not a big deal, but everybody has to follow the rule. I stay in my bed, you stay in your bed, and just bringing them back consistently every single time. It's that repetition that is a key to how they learn.
Got it. So just so I'm tracking, we were prepping the space, we're making it as safe as we possibly can, but we're also having conversations before there's even an issue, right? We're level setting these expectations up front and explaining in a positive way, this is what's happened, this is what we do, this is the expectation, this is the norm. And then when we do have a nighttime wanderer, then always calmly bringing them back to bed. It's not a whole, oh my, I can't believe you're out of bed. This is, oh, you could have fallen, you could have hurt yourself. Why didn't you listen to me? Like, we're just, okay, we have the safe space, and this is the expectation. Is that how you would recommend playing it out?
I think that is a really good way to think about it. The other piece of it is recognizing that they are doing what they're supposed to do in many ways, right? Developmentally, like, they are exploring and they're curious, and we want them to do that in many, many ways. We just also want them to be safe. But positive reinforcement tends to work better than punishment for all of us, even adults. So reinforcing praise when they do stay in their bed or when they go back quietly and calmly. You can, as they get older, you can do sticker charts and things like that as well. But just the positive reinforcement and the consistent reinforcement over and over again.
Yeah, in hearing you kind of say that, I'm remembering back when we went through this transition with my son. It wasn't wandering at night, but he would often wake up too early. It was a challenge to get him to go back to bed at 5 a.m. when he was supposed to be asleep until like 7 a.m. And for any parents facing similar issues, I found that using an okay to wake alarm clock can be really helpful. I programmed our Nanit sound and light machine for this exact purpose. It would play white noise throughout the night, and then at 7 a.m., the noise would quiet down and the light would turn green, signaling that it was time to wake up. And to your point, Krupa, it made managing those early morning wake ups a lot easier, because instead of reacting emotionally, I was overtired, waking up myself, instead of explaining and droning on, it's time to sleep, your body needs rest, it's too early, you need to go back to sleep. I could simply point to the machine and say, when your light is green, then it's time to wake up. It was simpler, more effective. It was very straightforward. The guidelines were very clear. And then he had a light to use as a clear visual cue.
And you weren't getting into battles, right? Like, this isn't me telling you, which toddlers are primed to kind of resist anyway. This is like an independent rule reinforcement. So hopefully you don't get into a battle over it. Now, whether or not your child actually will pay attention to a cue like that depends a lot on their personality, though. I think anyone who has like more than one child probably has one kid that would follow that rule and one kid that maybe wouldn't.
You are speaking a little bit of my lived experience, but it was also making it harder to be like, you can't really argue with the Nanit sound and light machine. It's an inanimate object. So
the rule's the rule.
yeah. Oh, I don't know. He said he's not green. So thank you for that additional tip. And just kind of thinking more broadly about the home. Safety at home is always top of mind, especially as toddlers become more independent. For both you, Holly and Krupa, what are the most important high-risk areas of the home that parents should baby-proof, toddler-proof, like furniture, windows, and how can we make sure these are secure even if our children manage to sneak out of their rooms?
So furniture, 100%, you know where I stand on that one. But with the doors and windows, those can be both ways that we protect our children and ways that they can get injured. So we're coming out of summer now, thankfully, from a window safety perspective. But we want to make sure that children can't open windows more than 4 inches. 4 inches or less is our guideline, and that is to make sure that, especially if it is a second or third story or higher window, we don't want them to be able to fall out. So that 4-inch rule kind of prevents them from being able to squeeze their head out and become top heavy. From the perspective of blinds, I've got cordless blinds in my office here, which is basically what you can get now. But if you have an older home and you have older blinds, corded blinds can be super dangerous. They're a huge strangulation risk. And I've got my bag of tricks here, and I'll pull one out for you so that you can see
Love
it.
a bag of tricks.
But you want to try to wind those cords up as best you can. So you can get, they're called either cord windups or cord cleats. And you can find ones that are adhesive, or you can find ones, this one takes a screw. And hopefully you can sort of see that. Sorry, I know that it's clear, so that's not always the most helpful. But basically this goes on the window frame, and then you wrap the cord around it. So that when you have the blinds pulled up and the cord's extra long, that you have that up high and out of reach. So especially if you've got any windows that are near their sleep area, you just want to make sure that that's up and out of reach and managed. So I understand not like switching blinds and window treatments is not an option for everyone, and it's very expensive to do. So cord cleats, super inexpensive, a very easy way to manage that. With doors though, so many different ways to manage doors. Sometimes you could use a door or doorknob or a door lever lock for areas like the bathroom. For the kitchen, which is another huge high risk area, you may want to use a baby gate. And some people actually put a baby gate in the door frame of their child's room so that if they don't want the child to, again, break an imaginary boundary and get out into the hallway, they could still open their door and call for you. But there's that physical barrier of, okay, but you're staying in this zone. So lots of tools to keep them out of those high risk areas. And maybe Krupa, you want to talk about some of the hazards in the high risk areas that we're worried about?
Yeah, so a lot of it depends on how your house is set up, right? But if you think about what your toddler probably wants when they wake up in the middle of the night, it's probably you. And so depending on where their bedroom is, where your bedroom is, what is between you and them, if it's dark, what are they going to trip over? Is there a risk that they're going to fall down some stairs? They're going to be trying to get to you. And then because toddlers are toddlers, also, if there's something that they were excited about or into, and they're like, I'm awake, maybe I'll go into the playroom and play with my toys. Like, is the playroom downstairs? Water is a big hazard. Bathtubs, like most toddlers, as they get older, they can turn the tap on. If there are stools around, we have had to start putting stools away because stools allow your child to get to a lot of things. Even the front door, we have stories of kids that have actually left the house because they've decided they want to go to the backyard or to the playground. And if they stand on their tippy toes, depending on what your door setup is, sometimes they can actually unlock the door and then they can get out. And you may not know. We have like a heavy lock now, high up, where only we can reach it, because we did catch my toddler trying to leave the house. It was not overnight, but he managed to unlock the door. And especially if they have a stool, like you want like one of those heavy latches that really takes like the effort of a grown-up or the dexterity of a grown-up to be able to get out. We also have,
Rupa, is this what you use?
that is exactly what we
Yeah.
use.
So
We
in
have that
case anyone's
same guy.
wondering, this is called a door guardian. And think of it almost like a hotel chain lock that you would put across the door, but heavy duty and can't be like kicked down. They are really, really strong, but like Group is saying, you have to have adult dexterity to be able to manage it. So the door guardian is my go-to.
I really
Sorry,
like.
continue.
The other thing actually, kind of related to that and related to windows, and say you have like a back door into the backyard or something, our home security setup is set up such that if any door or window opens, it actually like speaks into the entire house and says, you know, front door open, garage door open. And that allows, you know, if you're in a different area, even if it's during the day, like you're in the bathroom or something, you know, okay, the kid has opened the garage door and you know exactly where to find them. This helps, especially in the summer with things like hot car deaths, if they decide they're going to go play hide and seek in the car. Really, you want to be able to keep track of where your kid is all the time.
Yeah, this is such helpful information, especially like because you kind of you don't know what you don't know. And until you hear about, experiences from experts like you all about it never even occurred to me that a step stool is something that my toddler could then just shimmy over and get into something that, normally they wouldn't be able to access. I'm usually there to supervise or whatever. And your point about the bathtub tap, again, I wouldn't really consider that. So thank you so much for
Toilet,
raising that awareness. The toilet, yeah. So
they
thank
like
you.
flush, you know, they're curious about it all.
Yeah. I mean,
And I will
that,
just add there too, like there's both the water hazard from the perspective of drowning and from burns.
Mhm.
So it's just an area. If you can get a door lever like lock, just just prevent access. And I often get the follow-up question of, okay, but like what if they're potty training? Well, most children aren't potty training directly on the potty in the beginning or on the toilet in the beginning. So there's a little bit of that aspect mixed with you're probably going to need to go wipe their bum anyway. So the likelihood that you're going to have to direct them there and let them in. So in that first little bit where they're gaining that independence, having some of those layers in place, it's just a way to prevent those more serious injuries.
I
mhm.
also think that for that particular scenario, if your rule is, okay, you cannot get out of bed until like the light changes color, then say, well, if you need to use the potty, you have to call me and I will come, reinforces that the rule still is you cannot get out of bed.
Correct.
Exceptions are hard.
Yep.
Mhm. Well, this is actually a great segue into where I'd love to, put in some more attention is transitioning from crib to bed. Like we're talking about potty learning and all these other things that come with toddlerhood. Transitioning from crib to bed is something that I'm sure is on a lot of parents' minds. So, Holly, many parents in this webinar in general are wondering when it's time to move their little ones from a crib to a bed. What are some
So
signs that a toddler might be ready for this transition?
there's no firm rule with this. There's a lot of signs that you're looking for. There are some recommendations of keeping them in until they're 3 years old. And then you may have a toddler who's like 18, 24 months, and they're already trying to climb out.
Mhm.
So we don't want to see a child being forced to stay in a crib where they could then potentially injure themselves by doing acrobatics and trying to get out, just to hit some, imaginary goal.
Mhm.
So you want to look at anything that comes with your crib in terms of guidance because there can be differences in terms of what type of crib you have. But generally speaking, when children are around 35 inches tall, they are typically tall enough that they could climb out of a crib. They're also typically tall enough that they could climb over a baby gate. So around those times, you kind of have to be a bit aware that some of those things in your home may need to be reassessed. And once they try to climb things where a fall is going to happen immediately after, potentially, then we need to look at other solutions and education around that. So for that transition, I would say look mostly at their development, and sometimes it's ahead of their emotional development, their physical development and climbing out. So that it's hard. It's very hard. But that 35 inches climbing, that's you really need to reassess at that point.
I think
And,
in
oh, sorry,
practice,
Krupa.
though, in practice, what I often see is that parents are really eager to like take the next step, like they're excited about making that transition, and the child is not necessarily meeting criteria to be out of the crib and not necessarily even showing interest or awareness that being out of the crib is an option. We do have evidence that shows that waiting until age 3 does mean that kids are more likely to have the maturity and the impulse control that you need. Obviously, if your child is being unsafe, like you have no choice. If you need that crib for your next baby or something, you have no choice, right? But staying in the crib if you can, and if it is safe to do, is associated with earlier bedtimes, fewer nighttime awakenings, increased nighttime sleep duration and quality, and even decreased bedtime problems. Like there's actually like really cool studies that have found this to be true.
And it's a physical boundary instead of an imaginal one or imaginary one, right? So it's I can see how that would be
Effective,
super
right?
helpful. Yeah. And another thing I'll add there too is that depending on the style of your crib, if they are trying to climb out, there's some strategies around that. If one like side is higher, like if you have kind of high sides and a high back on it, sometimes turning the short side against the wall, sometimes putting them in a sleep sack can help deter climbing, but there's also toddlers that have done it. So it's not, none
They
of this
did
stuff is
it.
guaranteed. And trying to keep like furniture directly like away from the crib, so nothing that's right adjacent to the crib that they could go, I could probably get onto that, and then it wouldn't be such a fall. So those little temptation things, try to remove them if you can. But yeah, ultimately, if it comes down to being a safety issue, then you've done everything gold star, and then we need to reassess the rest of the home for hazards.
Well, that actually was going to be my next question is like considering where to, like, let's say your toddler is really showing interest in moving into a bed. They're also like developmentally, physically ready for the transition. I was going to ask like, where should you place the bed? But it sounds like just kind of, it should be as standalone as possible, or is it more of a concern when it's a crib that they could crawl out of?
So there's kind of like two options. I'm going to speak to three options, but there's really two main options in my personal opinion. There is a standard bed. So if you think of like a twin size bed, and then there is what we call a toddler bed. So a toddler bed means that there is some kind of rail built into it to help keep them in the bed so that they're not rolling off the sides. And that's helpful because, again, they are used to having the crib, and we know that kids get their limbs stuck in the crib slat sometimes and cry for us to bring them back to the middle. But once that's gone, kids fall out of bed sometimes. Toddler beds are typically lower to the ground. Of course, ideally, if you put something like a rug next to their bed, that helps too. But it has that physical barrier on the side to just help with that transition. You can get bed rails for a twin size bed. However, there are safety precautions with that. You have to follow the instructions very carefully. A lot of them have age minimums that you have to meet. And the main reason that we are trying to be careful with bed rails, but also have the bed otherwise away from the wall is something called entrapment. That's where we don't want a child to become stuck by the head between a bed and a wall. So, without getting grim, the third option, which is something a lot of people don't like to hear, bunk beds are not recommended under age 6. There is a lot of fall risk, there's a lot of entrapment risk, and they're typically up against a wall. We don't want children becoming stuck between the bed and the wall. So, away from the wall if it's a single bed. If you've got a toddler bed with rails, it's typically not as much of an issue, but we just want to prevent them becoming stuck there.
I know that a really big concern parents have is that their kid is going to roll out of bed and fall on the floor, right? Do you have any recommendations on whether like a mattress on the floor can facilitate that transition so they're rolling off? Are there any safety guidelines, for balancing parental concerns with also that safety as we kind of go through the transition from crib to bed.
I'm curious what Krupa's thoughts on this are. I wouldn't say that there's like a specific recommendation on my end, but having something softer for them to fall on. So in my opinion, it depends on what the floor covering is, right? So if you've got hard floors, maybe having a rug there. If it's a toddler bed and it's lowered to the ground, that sometimes the noise is a bit loud, but it's usually not that bad of a fall. It's not a fall that would cause like a traumatic head injury. We often worry that it will, but it wouldn't. Krupa, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. Sometimes some of these things that we think about that are going to add safety don't. I'm thinking very much of my 6-year-old who we had one of his bed rails on a twin bed, and he rode it like riding a pony. And actually did fall off and break his arm. So, there are things that, you think that you're doing, and sometimes stuff happens. From a keeping things on the floor standpoint, I have seen people sometimes put like mattresses or like some of the playroom kind of foamy pads down as well. The likelihood of having a severe traumatic brain injury from a fall from a bed that is like at a normal height is not high. But if you have like hardwood or something underneath it, then having something soft there to cushion is not a bad idea.
Very helpful. Thank you. Um, and Krupa, like, I guess on the topic of, parents thinking about all of this, like transitioning from a crib to a bed is a big step for both parents and toddlers. So what are some practical steps we can take to prepare ourselves mentally and emotionally for this change? And how about preparing our toddlers? What's the best way to help them get ready for the switch?
So for most things, children learn from concrete examples that they don't learn abstract concepts very well, especially in toddlerhood. So if you have social stories, if you have books, even if they watch shows, there's a lot of books on this specific topic. And if you're talking about it ahead of time, what will be different, what the rules are, what the consequences of breaking the rules are, you're essentially prepping them and then giving them concrete examples of people who are following the rules or who are not following the rules, and that there are sort of consequences to that. I think for a lot of sleep related issues, what parents don't always think about is that the conversation that has to happen before the transition is made has to happen between the parents, and you guys have to kind of come up with a philosophy or a concept that you want us both stick to, that you both are capable of sticking to. And if there's other caregivers that are involved with bedtimes, night times, nap times, things like that, nannies, things like that, you want to have both parents on board and have kind of an outline of the way that they want to respond. Because the worst case scenario is if you have a toddler who's breaking some rules and is behaving differently with one parent versus another because one parent reacts differently than another. That's confusing for the toddler. It's another, example where they don't know what the limits are, and having the limits be consistent actually helps them feel safe during transitions. Transitions are hard. I also think it's really important to try to, especially for a crib to bed transition, to try to make one transition at a time. If you're like really in the thick of potty training, maybe it's not the time to also make another transition. If you just had a baby, you're about to have a baby, maybe it's not the ideal time to make that transition. If you're anticipating, okay, I need the crib for my baby, then try to sort of do it a month or two ahead of that, so that the toddler is not associating this transition with, okay, there's a new baby and now they took away my crib. You want to try and make big transitions in isolation, like starting daycare. That's maybe not the best time to do it.
Yeah, and Krupa, that is exactly what I did. So my girls are almost to the day 2.5 years apart, and my older daughter was still doing fine in the crib, but I didn't want to buy like a second crib and then only use it for like 6 more months. So it was like, okay, we're about 6 weeks out from baby arriving. I think we need to start doing this transition. She had one of those convertible cribs where you could kind of take the rails off and then have like one side open. So we had it kind of in toddler bed mode for a little bit. And then after she had kind of gotten better at her imaginary boundaries, then we were like, okay, we think we're ready to get you a new bed. Let's go pick one out together. And then we were able to put that away. We actually physically put it away. So it was no longer visible as her bed. And then we brought it back out a few weeks later. It was so helpful to do it that way.
I
So
like what you're talking about. You're talking about doing it in a staged fashion. And I think that for a lot of kids, that's helpful. For our oldest and our second, actually, we did it in a similarly staged fashion, but we didn't have like a toddler bed option that we could switch to. So I got like an air mattress, and we did it via air mattress with the crib still visible. So like, oh,
Yeah.
you're a big kid, we're gonna let you try this new situation out, but if you can't stay on the air mattress, then we're gonna have to go back and get back in the crib. So like, depending on like what your situation is, you can do it staged that way. I think using the okay to wake features is part of your staging is also really, really helpful, so that the point at which the crib goes away, hopefully your child is already following those rules. Ideally. I
Yeah,
mean,
that feature
sometimes
is
that
so
doesn't
good.
happen, but
I love the okay to wake. I wish that I had that at that stage too. It's fairly new. I think it only came out like a few months ago. But having the ability to kind of see, oh, that child has decided to get up, and let's give them like a visual signal that maybe they need to stay in bed. So I mean, I'm always an obvious fan of the Nanit Pro monitor. I have been for a very long time. But if any of you haven't seen me on a Nanit thing before, I'm obsessed with the sound and light machine, like obsessed with it. Um, it does not live in my kid's room. It lives on my nightstand. I love it. I take it everywhere with me. I'm about to travel tonight, and I'm taking that with me. It goes on battery power if you need to. Those two things together, though, they work so great. I wish I had that when my girls were toddlers.
absolutely, the peace of mind is invaluable. But we've covered so much amazing ground in this last chunk, so I just want to kind of like summarize some of the key learnings that I had. So Krupa, your point about coming to the transition from crib to bed as a united front with your partner, your co-parent, your, surrounding support network and community just will make that transition easier for everyone. Preparing your child for the transition by talking about it, and then, also having, like you mentioned, reading books about the experience also is very helpful, and considering the overall timing so that this big milestone going from crib to bed is not butting into potty learning, starting daycare, a move perhaps, or a new baby coming. And then Holly, your point about really breaking out the stages of that transition to not just be, okay, tonight you're in a big bed. It's more like, okay, we're going to start here and we're just going to take little baby steps. And I think your point about also removing the crib so that it isn't suddenly we're taking the crib out of your room and putting it into mom and dad's room, where the new baby will sleep, can help with that transition as well, as our child doesn't feel like something is being taken from them and immediately turned over to this new baby that's coming. Anything else to add on to that?
no, I think
If you get a sound and light machine, you're going to use it forever for yourself.
And
So
I'm also, I
excited.
feel like,
I'm
Holly,
excited to
this
see who
might be a
wins
sign
it.
you need to.
Honestly, my husband gets upset when he's like, "You can't take that. I need it," and I'm like, "Well, it's mine." So
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing all of these invaluable insights and tips on toddler safety. Again, especially around that transition from crib to bed, because it isn't a one-size-fits-all plan. So having your expertise to understand the different ways that that can look is really helpful for so many families. Really just so incredibly helpful. But now I'd like to hear from the parents and the caregivers. So again, everyone in attendance, if you have any questions or need further clarification on today's topics, please drop them into the Q&A box. And we're going to spend the next few minutes addressing some of the questions, or as many of the questions as we can. Your participation makes these sessions even more valuable, so don't hesitate to ask anything you're curious about. Also, please feel free to follow at Safe Beginnings or at the Pediatrician Mom, where Holly and Krupa share so much of their expertise and can definitely provide you more tailored support. So a couple questions from the chat. First, let's tick off the quick one. Holly, what was the name of the anchor product you described?
So in general, TV or furniture safety straps are the products you would be looking for. I have a full recommended products list through the links in my Instagram. There's a few really good ones. Safety First makes a great one. There's a company called Safety Innovations, but I have it all linked in one place and categorized so you can find what you're looking for: gates, straps, general childproofing stuff. So yeah, if you hop onto my Instagram, you'll see it in the links.
And do you recommend gates at the top and the bottom of the stairs for toddlers?
Yes. So a lot of people think, oh, if I just have one at the top, then they won't fall down the stairs, but they can still climb up from the bottom and fall. So you do need it on both sides. But at the top, that's where you really need a hardware mount gate, because pressure gates, even if you feel like it's really solid, it's possible for those to be lodged out of place, like dislodged if a kid body checks it. We don't want them to go down the stairs with a gate. It can often make an injury even worse, and falling down the stairs is a bad enough injury on its own. So hardware mount at the top. The pressure gates are okay at the bottom. I personally prefer hardware gates on stairs at top and bottom, but as long as it's at the bottom of the stairs or dividing two rooms that are on the same level, then you could use a pressure gate in those scenarios.
Got it. Okay. And on the topic of stairs and baby gates, what type of gates could a family potentially use, when you have a banister that only has those skinny little bars?
Oh, I'm going to talk and I'll be slightly off camera getting a prop here for a second. You probably need something called a mount. And there are all sorts of different mounts you can get of different sizes. And I'll bring just a few over just so you can see them. But they are typically something that you would use. This one is actually for spindles specifically. So I think when you say banister, you mean the the little baluster. Their stair parts have very complicated names.
I know handrail.
Spindle balusters. This is actually designed to clamp against multiple ones, whether they're flat or round, versus something like this, which is designed to go around a post, a newel post, which is the post at the end of the stair rail. So you can get these and then screw the gate into these parts. So basically this allows you to screw into this, which is solid wood, instead of actually into your staircase itself. And then if you have a round post, don't worry, they make those too. So you can get, these are super great. They come in all sorts of different sizes. I also have them on that list if you're looking for recommendations. So you just want to measure what your balusters or your post sizes are and see what will fit. The one I'm showing you here for spindles, it's made by Cardinal Gates, and they have a really helpful video on the Amazon page for the product that shows you how it's installed. So if you're like, I don't know if that's the right one for me, they've got a video showing it. So it's really, really easy to figure that part out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. I had no idea these products even existed.
Full of props over here.
So helpful. Krupa, someone asked, my 22-month-old toddler currently sleeps through the night in his crib. Is it to be expected that his sleeping habits would change if and when moved to a toddler bed? I think so many of us can relate to this concern that suddenly we're going to have some more nighttime wakings or changes or disruptions. Can you share some insight?
It's possible. A lot is going to depend on his personality, and also kind of how you've set up that transition. But even if you do everything perfectly, some kids are just going to be more likely to follow the rules and follow something like an okay to wake clock. In terms of natural sleep transitions, sometimes as they're beginning to approach dropping a nap, which for a lot of kids happens somewhere between like 2.5 and 4 years old. Sometimes we start to see different types of sleep patterns overnight. If a child is, for example, going to daycare or preschool and they're having long naps in the afternoon, those kids are often more likely to struggle at bedtime with going to sleep at like a reasonable time. So they're more likely to be doing the thing where they're up and wanting your attention, getting out of bed. They're also more likely potentially to be waking up early as well because they're getting enough sleep. And so for some of those kids, especially, I see this a lot between like 3 and 4. It's sometimes what you want to do is try to pull back, shorten that nap or shift it a little bit so that they're fully awake by like 3:30 or 4 o'clock by mid-afternoon, so that there's a nice window for them to get nice and tired before bedtime. So a lot of this is going to depend on kind of what's going on in their environment and their personalities.
So, and it also kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about being very mindful of, the life transitions as well. So if they are starting daycare, like how is the transition to a toddler bed going to fit in to ensure that we're getting adequate sleep, restorative sleep, and so forth. So that's really helpful to think about how these different facets of our child's life kind of interplay when it comes to sleep.
And I wish that it was easy to say, oh, this is the answer and there's a black and white answer. But I think someone asked a question about, what age is it safe for a child to sleep on another floor, or to navigate stairs on their own. And we have general guidelines, but again, there's so much here that is the gray area because it depends on your child's development and whether they're neurotypical or not, etc. So a lot of especially the things around impulse control, and behavior, and that a lot will depend on your child.
Mhm. Mhm. And Holly, another clarifying question regarding the door guardian you recommended. One parent wrote that they've heard that similar door guardians and similar products are detrimental in emergencies like house fires. Can you share anything more about that?
Kripa and I actually have a lot of experience with this because probably about 3 years ago, maybe even 4, we did a post about fire safety and got so many questions about stuff like that, especially window locks, right? So the idea of limiting windows to 4 inches. The devices can be disabled by an adult, and they're not difficult to disable by an adult. But in a lot of these scenarios, it's not a scenario where a child would otherwise be able to exit themselves or exit safely out of the house themselves. So that's one of those things where if we're not there to assist them, the likelihood that the fire is between the two of us is probably high. And then in that scenario, we're probably putting them at risk by trying to get to them. Either we're putting ourselves at risk or both of us at risk. So in a scenario like their bedroom, for example, where maybe you have the window limited, that's if we open the door and we let fire into that room, even if we think we're helping, it can make the situation way worse for everyone versus the fire department breaking their window and getting in and rescuing them from the outside. So we can actually buy them time in a lot of those scenarios. So there's pros and cons to both. Making sure you've got working smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms will go a long way from even getting close to this scenario where you would be worried about the door guardian being the barrier. So making sure that you've got all your fire safety equipment up to date, I think, is really key. But also remember, there are other ways for us to rescue people. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Shifting gears a little bit, I do want to talk a little bit. There are a couple questions about arranging the room once you move from the crib to the bed. So quick question is, what about rocking chairs in their bedroom? Once we transition to a toddler bed, should we move the chair to another room? Krupa?
Yeah.
A lot of those rocking chairs can get like little fingers pinched in there. Yeah, I don't think those are safe.
And same with gliders too, like the way
Yes.
that the mechanism does this. Yeah.
Helpful. And is there an age that you'd recommend for a bed to be moved back against a wall, namely when entrapment risk is no longer a concern?
Not really in terms of moving it back against a wall. I would say that with age 6 is where that bunk bed kind of is considered to be safer. What we're worried about is if you think about like the proportions of a child and the height of a child, we just really don't want them to become stuck by their head. If their legs can get to the ground, it's less of an issue. But there's always that. I mean, I don't tell him I said this. I still have a brother-in-law who falls out of bed and he's like 40 something now. So some people never learn it. But we want to be sure that they've learned the boundaries of their bed. And generally speaking, from a safety perspective, age 6 and when that bunk bed kind of rule kicks in, I would say is probably a safe bet.
My 5-year-old will be really disappointed to hear that he has to wait 1 more year before we can explore a bunk bed. But
It's actually it's so hard because there's so many families in small spaces these days, and it's really hard.
There's so many cute bunk beds. Like they have all these like features that like make them so appealing.
no, there's
But
like a slide and a climbing wall. I'm like, I want that.
I really want you doing that in the middle of the night.
Yeah, exactly. Another clarifying question, jumping back to when we were talking about children potentially rolling out of their new bed, be it a toddler bed or a twin bed. Do you recommend mats on the floor by the crib or the bed?
Yeah, I would just say keep it soft. If the flooring's hard, if you have carpet, it's to actually so from a first aid perspective, I'll say to actually receive a head injury, you'd have to be at a much higher height than most beds to roll in and have a head injury. So, my daughter fell out of bed the other day. It happens. It still happens when kids are 6. She cried. We hugged it out. She went back to bed, but at no point was I concerned that she had a head injury because just the mechanism of that injury, it's really typically not a height that we are concerned about.
Now, it is possible to have other kinds of injuries, like breaking an arm, for example. But you can only protect against so many risks, right? So I think this is one of those situations where you're thinking a little bit about, okay, what are the worst possible risks? And I agree with Holly that the likelihood of a traumatic brain injury with a normal height bed is not high.
Well, Holly, it's so interesting to hear you and Krupa talk about how, actually pulling the bed away from the wall is a safer approach, because I would have assumed putting it against the wall, it's one less, place for them to fall. But
yeah,
thank you so much for bringing my attention to the, real concern about entrapment or head entrapment, like you called out, because it really was not on my radar.
yeah.
I think what could be hard also is a lot of people go on vacations, go to vacation homes, or like are staying at grandparents, and you can't just like always rearrange the furniture in somebody else's house. So if you have no choice, Holly, I'm actually curious about what your thoughts are on putting like a layer of something like a slim pillow or like a body pillow or something on the edge between the child and the wall. I'm just curious about like what you would recommend in that situation. Or is it better
Yeah,
for them to be on the floor?
I would say it's probably better to be on the floor. From a risk perspective, it's just anything that can shift, like there's a lot of variables there. I would say the floor.
There's also like little portable toddler beds that you can get that are almost like little camp beds that are easy to travel with.
Yeah.
Oh, so many amazing tips, and thank you for the product recommendations, the guidance. I just want to extend a big thank you to Krupa and Holly for your time and for sharing such actionable strategies to keep our toddlers safe and help us parents feel confident as our children grow from infants to toddlers and beyond. Thank you, Holly and Krupa, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope you found this session both helpful and informative. Have a great night. Thank you.
Thanks,
Night.
everyone.